Welcome back to Unfiltered. It's time for Here's the Deal. And Dara Parker and Paul Doroshenko join me from downtown Vancouver, our Shaw Tower today. Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for being with us. So we're going to start with a story that I find very interesting, especially as the mother of two young boys. So a 14-year-old Nanaimo kid takes his friend's locker lock, locks it to a sprinkler, ends up breaking the sprinkler, causing $48,000 worth of damage, and the school sues his parents and they have to pay for it. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's written into legislation in the School Act that you are responsible jointly and severably. And I have to tell you, it should strike terror in the hearts of parents across the province. This has been on the books since the 1950s, apparently. And it's only twice been litigated in court. I don't think people know about it.
No, I don't think they do either. I think it would be shocking to be presented with that kind of bill and that law being cited. So what do you think, Dara?
Well, what's the alternative? Who else should be responsible? I mean, I think that a 14-year-old should be able to deliver good judgment, and honestly, I think it was a fairly uncreative prank. And at the end of the day, the alternative is the public, and I'm not sure we should be held more responsible than the 14-year-old and their family. But for me, it raises the question, what if it's a family that would be devastated by a $50,000 charge?
Right, you mean
I understand that's a
Well, they may be.
Of course, I do mean financially devastated. And of course, $50,000 is a lot of money, period.
Yes.
But for some folks, that would wipe them out. And so I have some concerns about this legislation.
Well, that was my first question. Can they afford to pay it? What will they do if they can't? Will they have to declare bank? What are the options then if you can't?
Well, imagine. I mean, it doesn't have to be a $50,000 one. It might be a $350,000 one the next time this comes around. I mean, the question is, should this legislation be on the books in this way, or should the school boards have insurance to cover these things? Should your home insurance cover it? Maybe your home insurance does. That's a significant issue. But think about this for a second. If you are a parent and you're separated, or you have a child with somebody, maybe you haven't had contact with the child for 15 years, you're still on the hook pursuant to this legislation, because it's one little provision in the School Act that says that parents are jointly and severably liable.
And what about, Paul, what about some consistency in this too? I mean, this can't be the only incident of its kind, yet it's the only one we've heard about really in years. So,
well, it's only the second time that it's been litigated in BC Supreme Court that anybody knows of. I mean, it may have been settled out in many other cases. It may have been insurance companies settling it out. But the thing is, you've got to recognize that children are children. There's going to be roughhousing. There's going to be stupid things they do. What teenager doesn't do something stupid? And shouldn't the government be in a position where they require schools to have insurance for this, as opposed to coming and basically destroying? I mean, this can totally destroy a family. $50,000 is a huge amount of money. They can come back and collect it against the people's house. They can garnish you wages.
Right.
But we have to talk about responsibility. Children can be children. In this case, it was $50,000 worth of water damage. But what a 14-year-old, I think, should be held responsible. They have accountability to make good decisions. And how far does that apply? What other situation where someone's injured for life, are they held responsible in that case? I'm not sure about your children are children. 14-year-olds are old enough to make good decisions.
Sure, but set the amount at $10,000 or something like that, and the rest has to be insured by the province. I mean, the government, our provincial government, has to look at that legislation, because I'm telling you, my children are young, but I'm living in absolute fear now of my kids getting a little bit older and doing something stupid when they go to school. I mean,
Don't make stupid children.
I did a lot of my children are very
Just
smart.
kidding.
My children are very smart. You cannot control what your kids do when they're in school. And the point was, in that case, I mean, the judge noted, and both of the lawyers noted, that it's a draconian law, that it's very, very harsh. And look at, what will this do to this family? I mean, if they're paying for it out of their own pockets, which I suspect they are, based on the ruling, then it's huge.
Well, maybe this is a good opportunity for people to have those discussions with their kids and try to emphasize that this can be very, very, very detrimental to an entire family if you do something stupid.
But humor aside, I don't think that you can account for everything your children do. So I agree there's a danger in this legislation that needs to be seriously addressed.
Okay, let's leave that there. Now let's go into the hockey dad. Now this is sort of a related issue, but maybe it deals with things that parents do instead of their kids. So this situation was Hockey dad, a dad of a hockey player, a young hockey player, walks into the dressing room. Apparently, one kid hits his own kid. He is told about it. He gets enraged and threatens to kill the young child who just punched his own child. He ends up getting into quite a bit of trouble. He gets a conditional discharge, but let's talk about that. Should he have been charged? Should he go to jail for doing something like that? Do we take those threats seriously when you threaten an 11-year-old kid that you're going to kill them for hitting your own kid?
Certainly a stupid comment to make. I mean, hold your temper in a circumstance like that. You're supposed to be an adult. The expectation, especially around kids, is that you're going to be setting a higher standard. Absolutely unacceptable to threaten somebody like that. There's no doubt.
Well, and I'm interested in what this says about the state of minor league hockey in Canada and what kind of culture is developed. There's a lot of conversations about contact in minor league sports and competitiveness and overzealous parents, and I think this is one of those indicators that there is an unhealthy culture in a lot of these leagues, and I'm not sure it was just the father that was charged that is responsible for this. Both children were fighting with each other, and I'm sure they said this wasn't the first incident of violence. Right.
I don't think you can paint with the big brush like that. I think in a lot of minor hockey leagues are very aware of the problems that can arise when everybody's emotions get, when everybody gets emotional about these things, and they're aware of that. This seems like it's probably not a completely one-off, but it's an issue of the behavior of this one individual in this one circumstance. The matter's now gone to court. The court has heard everything. He's been granted a conditional discharge, which, I am accepting, bearing in mind the fact that I'm in court in North Vancouver very often, that it's the appropriate result in this case. I'm sure he's learned his lesson. I mean, imagine how humiliating it's been for him and his family going through this for these, few stupid words that he said. Yeah, it's a criminal offense. He committed a criminal offense, but what is the degree of punishment that's appropriate? It's probably, it seems to me that the discharge is appropriate.
I
agree, but I don't think it's unique. I'd be surprised. Parents make comments all the time, and I think that there really is a culture. The fact that this is a continued topic, that we're talking about minor league hockey specifically, but not exclusively, and the kind of intensity that we put on 9-year-olds, I'm surprised that you think this might be unique.
I don't think it's unique. I just don't think that, if we have this happen every few years, it's not a crisis. We're not at a position or point of moral panic. I'm sure all sorts of other things happen that are lousy and emotional during the course of these games, and I know people get upset, but I think that parents probably are fairly attuned to the perception of this and the concern about it, and I think the Minor Hockey League is probably very aware of it, and they don't like to see this sort of thing happen, so they discuss it. But you can't control every parent, you can't control every hothead. You do your best to do that, and the culture around it is always a concern. I remember being a kid and going to these games and knowing the parents that you just didn't even want to get near during the course of the hockey game. I don't know.
And that was consistent in your experience, that there were always some of those parents?
Oh, there's always
one I
of those
remember.
people
There's one I
everywhere.
remember, but I'm sure he's no longer a Minor Hockey League parent because that was 35 years ago.
Okay, well, we're going to leave this discussion at that point. Let's continue our Here's the Deal panel now with Paul Doroshenko and Dara Parker, who are joining us from the Shaw Tower in downtown Vancouver. Thanks for being with us, guys. So we just spoke with Stuart Greer with an update on the situation in France. And so let's talk about one of the things that's been trending on Twitter for the past couple of days. We all know Je suis Charlie, which has been one of the most retweeted hashtags in recent memory. But another one that's been trending is Je suis Ahmed, and that is because of Ahmed Merabet, the French police officer, the Muslim police officer who was shot and killed by the gunman 2 days ago. Have you been following that Twitter situation?
I know about it.
Yeah. So what do you think? What are your impressions when you hear that? I mean, everyone sort of attached themselves to Je suis Charlie right off the bat, and then a lot of people said, I'm not Charlie, but I am Ahmed.
I think it's a really important narrative. We know that when things like this happen, and of course the killings were horrific, full stop. There's nothing else to be said about that. but there's often a wave of anti-Islamophobia, sorry, that doesn't make sense, anti-Muslim sentiment
Right.
and Islamophobia, and I think that this introduces a different perspective. This reminds us that there's more nuance to the situation.
Right, and a lot of people want to point out that this man, who was Muslim, who did not necessarily agree with what was happening at Charlie Hebdo, was there to protect their right to do so.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the point. He was a police officer who was working for the benefit of the people of France, and he ultimately, was murdered by these people, doing what he was supposed to do, being a police officer, and he's also a Muslim. And you've got to remember that there's many millions of peaceful Muslims in the world, and we've got a small handful of people who decide that this is their version of Islam, and they take it to this sort of level of extremism. But there's lots of Muslims who have suffered too. There were Muslims in the Twin Towers on September 11th. There's been lots of Muslims who have suffered as a result. And think of the conflicts that have taken place, in Afghanistan and Iraq and various other locations. I mean, Muslims are often the victims of these crimes as well.
And religious affiliations aside, I think that perhaps a lot of people, they may not agree with a satirical magazine that publishes very controversial photos, or cartoons, but they could certainly be in solidarity with an innocent bystander who was just doing their job and got caught in something.
Well, he was protecting freedom of expression and freedom of speech, right? These are underlying principles of French democracy and Canadian democracy and every other major democratic country in the world. We have freedom of speech, and this it's obviously horrible for the people who died, but it's an attack on freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And here was a fellow who was acting as a police officer, there to protect those freedoms that we enjoy. And I guess that's the sort of the devastating thing, but it's a worthwhile narrative to look at. Let's not forget that there was lots of other people who were murdered here, but it's a worthwhile narrative to remember that these Muslims are a component of the French population, the Canadian population, around the world.
For me, I hope it introduces more complexity, that it doesn't just become Muslim versus Christian or white versus brown or Europe versus the Middle East, but that we start to think about the complexity of all of our identities and the fact that when these cartoons were being done, they weren't being done in a vacuum. We live in a fairly racist world where there is a lot of Islamophobia. And so what does that mean? Does depicting a cartoon of the Prophet, is it the same as depicting a cartoon of Jesus Christ? I don't think it is, because I don't think those two religions are seen equally in the world. And so this hashtag, for me, it inspires some more complex thinking around this issue.
I hope that's the case, but I'm not optimistic.
You're never optimistic, Paul.
I'm often optimistic.
There's been a flood of content on the media, and I think if you look to sources outside mainstream media, there's a lot of really thoughtful articles being produced that do challenge this. So I think it's incumbent upon the viewer, upon the consumer, like myself, to seek out those articles, to find that content and to start to challenge ourselves.
Try to continue that dialogue. I agree, Dara. Okay, it wouldn't be a here's the deal unless we talked about Cosby, it seems. So he was in London, Ontario last night, and kind of an interesting development. It was his first really public acknowledgement of the controversy around him. He made reference as a woman was getting up to go get a drink. He said, well, you don't want to be a woman around me with drinks. So what do you think of that flippant joke he made last night?
Flippant and distasteful joke, bearing in mind the controversy about his alleged and maybe probable past behavior.
Maybe probable. He's had over 25 women accuse him of sexual assault. I'm not sure what he was thinking when he said that. It's not funny. It doesn't align with his typical sense of humor. It wasn't in running with the rest of the content around families and his wife, harassing him and stuff like that. Completely inappropriate and shameful. When you have 25 people chorusing to say the same thing, the same details, the same narrative over and over, I'm not sure why he was in Canada in the first place.
Well, that's a whole other issue, whether his shows should have been canceled and whether people should be attending those shows. But I think it's a pretty strange way to address this controversy.
Well, I think it's a stupid way to address the controversy, because I'll tell you, if I was his lawyer, I would be telling him, don't discuss anything like that, because if you look like you're flippant about it, and ultimately you end up having to sit in the witness box a year and a half down the road or 2 years down the road, they're going to be showing that video, they're going to be discussing that, and they're going to be using that to point out the fact that, you know, you're not taking this seriously or whatever. I mean, it's terrible optics for a guy who's already looks awful. I mean, I can't believe that he is still persuading himself that it's appropriate to go out into the public.
So that's a technical analysis. I think morally it was wrong. I mean, yes, obviously the optics aren't good. I don't know if he was being very strategic, but who makes a rape joke when you're being accused of being a rapist?
Well,
Right.
a jerk does.
Apparently Bill Cosby does.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, if I was that woman, I would be not feeling very positive about Bill Cosby making a rape joke about me.
Which is one of the things that continues to blow my mind, is that I watched a number of clips of audience members, all of them female identified, who all applauded and supported the show, and, you know, were frustrated at the man who was yelling in the show and who got removed from the show. They all thought that Bill Cosby was great.
They're true adherents.
I find that
They believe in the faith of Bill Cosby.
I find that completely astonishing personally, but thanks guys, great discussion. Thank you for joining us. That's Paul
My pleasure.
Doroshenko and Dara
Cheers.
Parker.